I knew the company had stopped seeing me the day I sat through another executive meeting and listened to a senior vice president explain my entire compliance strategy, as if he had created it himself. I had spent days building that plan while fighting a pounding headache and studying for my MBA exams, but no one mentioned my name. They smiled at him, applauded his ideas, and moved on while I quietly wrote notes like I had never existed. That had become my normal life. I was the person everyone called. When federal rules became confusing, or when outside auditors started asking difficult questions. Yet the same people who depended on me treated compliance like an annoying interruption. They wanted shortcuts and easy answers while I kept reminding them that regulations were not optional. I stopped expecting appreciation because I knew I would never get it. Instead, I started focusing on something that belonged only to me. 3 evenings every week, I carried my laptop to a quiet sandwich shop near campus where I worked on my MBA after finishing a full day at the office. I never told anyone because I was not looking for praise. I simply wanted a future where my career did not depend on people who confused popularity with leadership. Every assignment I completed felt like another step toward freedom. Even when I was exhausted, I kept going, because I refused to spend the rest of my life holding together a company that barely noticed I existed. Our office looked successful from the outside, but inside it was held together by appearances. Promotions depended more on friendships than talent. People spent more time laughing at executive jokes than solving real problems. Then our vice president's wife joined the company as the new director of workplace culture. She had influence, confidence, and absolutely no understanding of compliance. She loved talking about positive energy, emotional connections, and company spirit, while I spent my days preventing legal violations that could destroy the business. She quickly decided she did not like me. I never joined office gossip, and I never pretended bad ideas were brilliant. When she suggested replacing detailed compliance reminders with cheerful motivational messages, I politely nodded and quietly fixed the legal risks after every meeting. She wanted people to feel inspired. I wanted the company to avoid federal investigations. Those priorities never fit together. Even though I rarely complained, I carried an enormous workload. I answered emails late into every night, took emergency calls whenever outside auditors appeared, and rewrote important filings after executives changed them into marketing language that ignored legal requirements. They believed I would always stay, because I always cleaned up every disaster. They never realized silence does not always mean loyalty. Sometimes it simply means someone has already decided to leave. While executives celebrated successful presentations, they were often presenting reports, recommendations, and risk assessments that I had written behind the scenes. My ideas appeared in investor meetings, leadership speeches, and planning sessions without my name attached to any of them. At first, that disappointed me. Eventually, it became proof that I no longer belonged there. I stopped trying to earn recognition and quietly prepared for the next chapter of my life. Everything changed during a company celebration at an expensive hotel. Employees gathered under bright lights, with music, food, and forced smiles, pretending another ordinary business quarter deserved a grand celebration. I stood near the edge of the courtyard drinking soda because I still had an MBA exam later that evening. That was when the vice president's wife walked directly toward me, wearing an expensive outfit and the confident smile of someone who expected an audience. She gently touched my arm and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I heard you are still working on your little MBA program. That is adorable." Then she tilted her head and continued. "You should really focus on this company instead of personal projects. We need employees who are completely committed." The conversation around us stopped. Several executives looked in our direction before awkward laughter spread through the crowd. Nobody defended me. Nobody reminded her that I had carried the compliance department for years. I simply smiled, thanked her for the advice, and took another sip of my drink. There was no reason to argue because I already understood something they did not. My future no longer depended on their approval. Only a few hours later, while I was still wearing the same dress from the company event, Human Resources asked me to come into a private meeting. The representative greeted me with rehearsed kindness and explained that leadership believed I no longer matched the organization's culture. She praised my intelligence, while suggesting I lacked the enthusiasm and positive attitude they wanted in the workplace. I listened without interrupting until I finally asked one simple question. "Are you ending my employment?" She quickly insisted they were offering me a graceful opportunity to move on and focus on my education, as though they were doing me a favor. I almost smiled because I recognized many of the phrases she used. I had helped write parts of those separation policies years earlier. Then I asked another question. Who will become the new chief compliance officer after I leave? She hesitated before saying legal would temporarily divide my responsibilities while leadership figured out a long-term solution. She even mentioned that the vice president's wife would help guide the transition because of her passion for company values. That answer told me everything I needed to know. They had absolutely no understanding of what my position required. A registered chief compliance officer could not simply disappear without legal consequences. Yet nobody in that room seemed aware of the rules I had spent years teaching them. The representative handed me a separation packet and thanked me for my service. I accepted it politely without opening the envelope. My calm expression made everyone believe I had accepted defeat. They thought I would quietly sign the paperwork, disappear, and allow them to continue pretending nothing important had changed. Instead, I walked out of that meeting completely certain of one thing: I would not sign anything, until I protected myself because they had forgotten one very important detail. The government still recognized me as the company chief compliance officer, and unless they officially reported my departure, the mistake they were about to make would become far more expensive than they could possibly imagine. The next morning, I walked into the office like every other workday. I wore my navy blazer, carried my laptop, and greeted the receptionist with the same calm smile. Nobody realized they were watching my final hours inside that building. People laughed. Near the coffee station, talked about leadership podcasts and celebrated another meaningless business victory, while I quietly prepared to leave forever. Inside my office, I turned on my computer and looked through my inbox. Hundreds of unread messages waited for me. Many were marked urgent, but I no longer felt responsible for solving problems that leadership refused to understand. Lawyers were still asking questions about compliance issues I had warned them about months earlier. Executives had ignored every warning because following the rules always seemed less exciting than chasing another client or another headline. I deleted every message, then opened a new email. My resignation was short, respectful, and impossible to misunderstand. I informed Human Resources, the executive team, and legal that I was resigning immediately. I reminded them that the company needed to update its regulatory records to reflect my departure, and wished everyone future success. There was no anger inside those words. Only facts. After reading it one final time, I sent the message closed. My laptop, removed my company badge, and carried everything to the front desk. The young receptionist looked surprised when I handed over my equipment. She asked if I was leaving early for the day. I smiled and gently told her I was leaving for good. She wished me luck without realizing how much that simple conversation meant. As I walked out of the building, I felt lighter than I had in years. There was no farewell party, no emotional speech, no applause, just the sound of my footsteps carrying me toward a future that finally belonged to me. What nobody inside the company understood was that replacing a chief compliance officer required official government filings. Until those records changed, I remained the registered compliance officer on paper. Even though I had resigned, they still carried the legal responsibility of updating federal records. I had reminded them in my resignation email, but I already suspected they would ignore it. The following morning, I met a close friend for breakfast. Before I finished my coffee, my phone buzzed with a screenshot from someone still working inside the company. A conversation between executives showed they had simply decided another manager would handle compliance until further notice. One employee asked whether federal paperwork needed to be completed. The vice president brushed the concern aside, saying they would deal with it later because employee morale mattered more right now. I stared at the screen for several seconds. They still believed compliance could be handed to anyone with an open calendar. They had learned nothing during all the years I worked beside them. For a brief moment, I considered warning them again. Old habits are difficult to break. I had spent years protecting people from their own careless decisions. But then I remembered every ignored email, every stolen idea, every late night spent fixing mistakes created by leaders who never accepted responsibility. They had made their choice, and now they would live with it. Instead of worrying about the company, I opened my own laptop and continued writing my MBA capstone. My research focused on leadership failure and organizational risk. Suddenly, the subject no longer felt theoretical. It was unfolding in real life. Meanwhile, the company continued pretending everything was under control. Lawyers requested meetings with the new culture director about regulatory deadlines, but she postponed them because she was busy redesigning employee orientation. The legal intern repeatedly warned executives that the company still had no officially registered chief compliance officer. He even attached the exact federal regulations, explaining the risk. Nobody listened. The chief executive dismissed the concern as unnecessary worrying. The intern was quietly reassigned to another project, and the warnings disappeared beneath endless conversations about branding, workplace happiness, and company culture. Later that afternoon, the culture director proudly sent a company-wide email about integrity, positivity, and teamwork, complete with cheerful quotes and colorful graphics. Employees praised the message while the most serious legal problem the company had ever faced continued growing in complete silence. The young legal intern eventually contacted me through my personal email. He thanked me for everything I had taught him and admitted that I had been right about every warning. I read his message several times before closing it without replying, not because I blamed him, but because I finally understood that fixing the company was no longer my responsibility. The following afternoon, I received an unexpected email from an associate auditor at the Securities and Exchange Commission. We had briefly met at a professional conference the previous year. His message was friendly and simple. He wanted to let me know that the agency would be conducting a routine compliance review at my former company the next morning. I slowly read the email twice before leaning back in my chair. The timing could not have been more extraordinary. I replied politely, explaining that I had resigned earlier that week and was no longer associated with the company. I suggested he contact their legal department for any coordination, then wished him well. Immediately afterward, I forwarded the conversation to my attorney, together with a brief note explaining that the company had still not updated its regulatory filings. I also reminded my lawyer that I had preserved every email document and communication connected to my resignation. After closing my laptop, I sat quietly beside the window, watching the afternoon sunlight move. Across the room, I expected to feel guilt or worry. Instead, I felt peace. I had done my job. I had warned them. I had documented everything. The consequences now belonged to the people who believed culture could replace compliance. The next morning, while I worked peacefully on my MBA, the government auditor walked through the front doors of my former workplace and politely asked the receptionist one simple question. Could I please meet with your chief compliance officer? That was the moment. Everything they had ignored finally began catching up with them. The auditor waited calmly in the conference room while employees rushed through the office searching for answers. Someone called the legal department. Another executive searched old emails while the chief executive hurried into the meeting expecting a simple conversation. Instead, the auditor politely introduced himself and explained that he needed to review company records with the registered chief compliance officer. The chief executive cleared his throat and explained that I no longer worked for the company. The auditor nodded and asked who had officially replaced me. Silence filled the room. Nobody had an answer. Lawyers searched government records while human resources looked through personnel files, hoping someone had completed the required paperwork. They found nothing because nobody had ever filed the change. The auditor calmly explained that according to federal records, I remained the registered chief compliance officer. He also pointed out that several important compliance documents had been submitted after my resignation. If those filings had been completed using my name without my authorization, the company faced a much larger problem than a simple paperwork mistake. Panic spread across the leadership team. They searched computer logs, email records, and document histories trying to discover who had submitted the filings. Every answer created another question. Nobody could explain why my resignation email had been ignored or why my warning about updating federal records had never reached the people responsible for regulatory reporting. The auditor requested copies of internal communications, resignation documents, and filing histories. He remained professional throughout the meeting, but everyone understood the situation had become a formal investigation. What leadership had dismissed as an administrative detail had become a serious legal issue. While all of this unfolded, I was sitting quietly at home working on my MBA capstone, my phone remained beside my notebook as messages arrived from former coworkers describing the confusion inside the office. I read them without celebrating. There was nothing satisfying about watching people create their own disaster after ignoring repeated warnings. News of the investigation spread quickly. Financial reporters published articles explaining that regulators were reviewing compliance failures at my former company. Investors immediately began asking questions. Clients wanted reassurance that their accounts had been handled correctly. Executives who once ignored compliance suddenly realized how expensive neglect could become. A few days later, my attorney received an email from the company. They wanted me to return as a temporary consultant with generous pay, flexible hours, and full authority to help stabilize the situation. The same people who had questioned my commitment now claimed my experience was essential. I read the proposal carefully before forwarding it back to my attorney with one simple instruction: decline the offer politely. I had already given them every opportunity to avoid this outcome. They chose pride instead of preparation, and I had no interest in rescuing them from the consequences of their own decisions. Soon afterward, I organized every document, every email, every meeting note, and every warning I had ever written. Then I submitted everything through the proper legal channels. My goal was never revenge. My goal was accuracy. Every concern I had raised was supported by records, timestamps, and evidence. The truth did not need dramatic speeches because the documents spoke for themselves. Inside the company, leadership struggled to control the damage. Clients questioned their confidence. Employees worried about their futures. Investors demanded explanations. The culture presentations, motivational slogans, and cheerful meetings that once impressed everyone suddenly meant nothing because none of them could replace accountability. During the next quarterly earnings call, financial analysts asked direct questions about the government investigation. The chief executive attempted to avoid detailed answers, but every response created more concern. The market reacted immediately, and confidence in the company continued falling. As the months passed, several executives quietly left the organization. The vice president's wife disappeared from leadership without the celebrations that had once welcomed her. The legal department worked endlessly, responding to investigators while the board searched for ways to rebuild trust that had already been lost. Meanwhile, I completed my MBA surrounded by peace instead of constant emergencies. My final research focused on leadership responsibility and the importance of respecting compliance before problems become crises. When my professor asked whether the project had been inspired by personal experience, I simply smiled because the answer was obvious without saying a single word. Looking back, I realized the greatest lesson had nothing to do with regulations or government agencies. It was about self-respect. I had spent years believing loyalty meant sacrificing myself for people who never valued my work. Walking away taught me something far more important. A company can replace an employee, but it cannot replace integrity once it chooses to ignore it. I never needed revenge. I only needed the courage to leave. The truth handled the rest, and in the end, the paper trail I had carefully protected became louder than every meeting, every title, and every empty promise they had ever made.